Hey, Silas here. So, the next video is going to be a talk between me and my friend Nick. I met him just a few months ago, but we've become fast friends, and we enjoyed a lot of times just sitting around having different conversations and thought, hey, let's actually record some of these conversations and share them with you. So, that's what it's going to be. This conversation is going to be about private property. We had set it for an hour, but it ended up going much longer, and I just want to upload the whole thing. You guys can take your time and watch it as you want. Remember, you can put things in 2 times speed. You can pause and watch the stuff later. But this is going to be a series of them. There's a lot we're going to continue from this video and talk about different topics. I already uploaded one conversation topic with my friend Melissa about that one. We had a question lined up on who's hurt most in a situation, in a single parenthood situation. This one was private property. I got a few more lined up after this, and hope you enjoy it. Just getting right into the video. There wasn't too many introductions, so I'll just get right into the video. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess we should just come up with our own definition then. I think it's better, because every online definition is going to be different. It's going to, I think we need something that really is like cuts down to the chase. Like, what exactly is it in the most simplistic form, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're both relatively close in our viewpoints, I would say. So I'd say we have a similar mindset. So, some people, particularly very left-leaning communists, socialists, they delineate personal property from private property, because to them that's key to their ideology. So, but you and I, to me, personal property, it's the same as private property.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely comes from it, because the personal is, I think, that's where you start the whole private property thing. You own yourself, and then from there, everything else comes from that, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think we may have had this discussion in the past. Something like intellectual property, right?
Yeah.
We would not consider that private property because it's not something physical, right? An idea is not something you can contain. It's not something you could steal. If I draw something on a piece of paper or write something down and you see that and write it down, you're not really stealing anything, technically speaking, right?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the conversations we had, which was a struggle trying to establish the situation with intellectual property. Now, it's because in that sense, with the ideas, it's what do you do with those ideas? And I've been struggling with this too, because somebody says, okay, if I have a belief, let's say I had an idea for something, and I have an intellectual property right on it in one state, yet you, another state away, come up with that similar idea and start that idea, and you haven't heard it from me. Even if at that point I have the quote-unquote intellectual property, what's called trademark, or I own that IP in, let's say, Kansas, and then for some reason you in Minnesota come up with the same idea, but you start it. I own it, but I haven't done anything with it. I have no plans of doing anything with it. It's just sitting there in some bank or in some IP bank somewhere saying, okay, Silas owns this.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you start it and then you bring it into Kansas, for some reason I can sue you for ownership of that idea. I don't know what happens in the court cases when something like that happens, because I mean, it has to have happened. And I think there's probably precedent for something like that. So
yeah, I'm sure it's happened. I wouldn't consider that private property. I mean, that's a discussion for another day. We could talk about, as in this country, should we have intellectual property, whatever. Regardless of whether or not, you have the right to that, I wouldn't consider that private property. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Right now, I would have to say yes. Let's see how this conversation goes once we start defining what we mean by private property. So, well, of course, first of all, the private property aspect, we said with the individual, okay, what was it? What was it you said before again? You said private property and, was it personal ownership?
Personal property,
yes. Personal property.
Like communist, Marxists, they have a very definite this is private property, this is personal property. Whereas I personally don't see a difference. Because to them, it's fundamental to their ideology. If you own land, which you can, that's fine. But if all of a sudden you are growing apples on that land and you want to sell it, that's no longer personal property, it's private property to them. And to me, I don't see a difference. To me, it's the same thing. If you own land, you own land, and that's private property. Just same if you own a pen, it's your pen, that's private property, right?
Yes, I think that would be completely interchangeable. But playing devil's advocate somewhat here, someone would say your personal property would be something like your body, where you can't technically rescind ownership of your body. And this goes into the question, can you sell yourself into slavery? Can you opt into slavery? So they might say the land is technically separate from you, and once you change your intentions for that land, then all of a sudden now it can change its status. Technically you can I could relinquish that land to my son or to a friend, or somebody else could buy that land. But someone would argue, can someone actually buy your body? Can somebody buy your brain, your physical brain? No, that's part of you. That's part of your person. So what would you say to something like that?
Yeah, I think in a sense you can sell your body, like prostitution, or just labor in general. I think in a way you're selling your energy, your body. But yeah, I guess you can't sell your own consciousness. I don't know where it really stems back to, because if you have a hole in your backyard and you want to dig, and you pay me to dig that hole, in a way I am selling my physical body, right? I'm selling my labor. I have to
that's a key.
Spend it.
Sorry, your labor.
No, yeah, labor. But I think, labor obviously includes your physical body. And the same thing if you're you're an accountant, you're selling your mental capacity, your thinking abilities for a set amount of time. You're selling that because you're devoting your mental abilities and your effort, with your thinking to solve math problems or whatever your job requires you to do. So, I don't know if I would call that slavery, but in a sense you can sell, your physical body or your mental capacity to some degree. You can't completely relinquish yourself, because then you wouldn't be you. So
that's the thing right now. Because, okay, if somebody says you can sell yourself, let's say you go with the prostitution thing, which is a regular one that's discussed. So if somebody sells themselves as a prostitute, even if it's actual intercourse, they're still in the process of doing that. So it's the actions that are going on, digging the hole. It's the results of them thinking and acting that they're actually selling. Because they're still moving their body. They're still choosing to bring their body to that location. They're still choosing to say those words to you. When you pay someone for that point, there's a difference between paying somebody to, a stripper or paying a girlfriend versus somebody willingly being in that relationship with you. It might be the same physical actions. When you go and buy a prostitute, it may be the same physical actions, but there's something different with that than having a girlfriend who ostensibly willingly comes in and has those same physical actions with you. You wouldn't say, I wouldn't consider those the same, but the actions themselves is something you're purchasing. But now if you're purchasing actions versus not the physical body, then what if those actions are ideas, are separate from that person? What if that person puts those actions on a video? Let's say somebody puts the webcam girls. If a webcam girl comes on and she does a dance in a webcam, she owns that dance even though she's not physically dancing for every person watching that video, right?
Well,
now I'm wondering where does that go to become intellectual property? Where you said, sorry, I'm all over the place with this, but I'm trying to piece this together. Okay. But when you said something like an ability to solve math, to solve a math problem, so that's how it comes to a situation where if I had the ability to run a business, to create this idea, and then in a case if somebody directly hears that idea from you, and then they go out and they do that same idea, somebody can say, yes, my ability to come up with a plan of running this business is my property. Whether you're paying me as a CEO directly to run this business for you, or if you steal my idea and run it in absentia of me actually being there.
Right. Well, the thing with stealing ideas, I don't believe that falls into private property because. So if I write something, here's two scenarios, right? I come up with an idea and I put it down on a piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
That piece of paper is my property. So we assume, right? So if you take that physical piece of paper, you are stealing my private property. But if, we're on a bus or something and you glance over and you see what I wrote down and then you look at it and you write it down yourself, I wouldn't consider that stealing private property. Now, whether that is theft, that's a discussion for another day. But I don't think that's in the category of private property.
But wouldn't that be key? Can you steal something? Can it be theft? Can theft exist without private property?
I don't know.
I imagine it can't. I can't steal your air if we're walking around outside and just breathing the air. Even if it's right in front of your face and I'm all of a sudden take 2 breaths when you take one. You can't say oh, you stole my air. But if we were, let's say in a suit, let's say we were in space for some reason and we're in suits and then we both have tanks and then I'm yeah, I'm just going to breathe and start working out in space and you're just taking your time walking slowly. Then I siphon some air out of yours. Then that's the only situation you can say somebody's stealing your air. So I don't see how theft could exist without private property, which is a key part of why we're having this conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
And that you actually brought up a good point with the whole oxygen thing. I think there are certain things that have to be collective, right? Certain things, because when I breathe air, right, all the carbon dioxide, whatever is in my breath that I exhale, it's floating around, right? And when I breathe in there, I'm taking air in. So air is kind of always collective, right? If I smoke a cigarette and you're next to me, you're going to breathe in all the chemicals from the cigarette, right?
Yeah.
If I start a factory and start pumping coal residue into the air, in a sense, if you're near that factory, you're going to breathe it in. So even if I claim land, right, and you build something next to me, let's say a tomato farm, right, and I build a factory, and all that pollutant air right next to the tomato farm is going to cause your tomatoes not to grow. So am I violating your private property by doing that? Would you say?
Well, in that sense, if you own the property, then yes, because your property has been affected. And I think that's where it comes down to the effects. I think it's the effect of the person. Why are those tomatoes your private property versus just wild tomatoes? Like, you wouldn't just walk in and, like, if that was your farm, I wouldn't come there and sue the company on behalf of you. I mean, I guess you could in some weird, say you have an insurance company or whatever. But I'm saying, why isn't that just everybody's farm? Why are you personally interested in the welfare of those tomatoes? I think it's because that private property is extended from your personal property, which I do think personal and private property they're interchangeable terms in this sense, at least from how I'm thinking. We haven't gotten to the point where I think we've differentiated the two terms between personal and private property.
No, because I don't think we need to. I think they're the same thing.
So, no, I mean, most definitely.
So my question is, like, is pollution violating the NAP? If I pump chemicals into the air and it somehow affects you, am I violating the NAP by doing that?
Well, yeah, I think we should also say NAP because some people will come to the channel and have no idea what we're talking about.
That non-aggression principle.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to explain it.
No, you can explain it.
I think
okay, the non-aggression principle, in general, it's just the non-initiation of force, non-initiation of aggression. So I think the main things that are brought up against it, people say, oh, if somebody punched you in the face, you can't hit him back. No, we're not talking about absolute pacifism. We're just talking about not initiating aggression. So that's not going out of your way to harm somebody else. Self-defense is not that. If somebody is giving a credible threat to you, it's not that. But now that in that situation, that's also your responsibility to assess what a credible threat is and not just think like, oh, a baby said something to me, so I'm going to punch this baby. I mean, that's not it. But then if somebody says, I am going to come by your house and shoot you, and you know they have guns and they've shot someone before, and you see them go into their house, if you decide to tackle that person and subdue them, hold them down, that's not initiation of force. That's self-defense. So yeah, initiation of force, non-aggression principle, just don't step on snake. Pretty much. Yeah.
To get down to the point. No step on snake.
Okay, so yeah, is the tomato situation a violation of the non-aggression principle? I would have to say yes, because you're damaging positive effects somebody else has done. You're damaging the value of what somebody else has accomplished. And I think that's another thing. When you said some things have to be collective, I think it depends on when. It depends on how. It depends on the people involved. For example, rights towards property. Like, I think one thing you see this in different cultures coming together. Not even different cultures, it's different ages of people. Kids have a whole different conception of what is theirs and what is somebody else's. They're like, oh, I see that, I want it. They take it, and then 2 seconds later they drop it, and they don't really care about it anymore. Yeah. It kind of goes out because for that little sliver of time, it was valuable to them, and they wanted it, and it all of a sudden was more want than anything else in the world. Then it goes back to just the ether of collective nothingness, pretty much. Now you take that to entire societies. I think they said, what was the whole situation with Manhattan, the island of Manhattan in New York? They said like it was traded for beads and some blankets, but then I heard that the Native Americans they didn't have the lifetime ownership type thing. It was more, we're not using this now, so we'll rent this to you in a way. And then later on, we can come back and still use it. But they didn't have the same kind of understanding where they valued ownership of land for a generational type thing where it's like, even if I'm not directly digging on it right now, you can't just come back later and be like, hey, how about I get back on this? It's like, no, you sold that to me. So I think with some of those things, what I'm trying to get to is that even air itself, as we discussed in the situation on the earth, air is completely collective. Like in general, if you're walking outside, it doesn't really matter. But then if it's the air in my home, I can say it's a no smoking home. I have some kind of ownership of that air. So now when you get to a situation where there was a time when countries didn't really care about airspace, but now countries establish ownership of the airspace, or they say like over the airport, you can't fly over the airport because that's owned by this airport, and if you violate that airspace, you can be held accountable. So I think private property, what can be owned, changes due to the value somebody can get out of it. So now that's where you get to the point, how do you get the ownership of something? Now, if you don't value your physical body, maybe you're willing to sell it for whatever amount. You're like, yes, I'm willing to sell my body for $50. Somebody else may value their body more, and then they'll get to the point where like, okay, we'll take $5 million for them to do the same thing somebody might do for 50. So what makes the things that are currently collectively owned, essentially, or not owned by anyone, what makes those things valuable enough to make them fall under private property or become private property?
Well, my question is more so how. I mean, like how would you even? You can't break up air. It's free flowing. I mean, you could, unless we all live in like oxygen masks. I see no physical way to privatize it. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not even a matter of like, is it valuable to do this? Whatever. It cannot physically happen. So there are certain instances where something cannot be privatized. And I guess my question is, like, what do you say to that? What's your solution to that issue? Like, how do you apply the non-aggression principle to something like air or like a river, or the ocean?
I think that's one key thing. I said it's already been done in a way when they say the airspace. You can't fly over certain areas.
Right.
Where it just says, okay, or they put like a no-fly zone over Syria. They're like, you can't fly over Syria in the airspace. Once you violate this airspace, we can shoot you down. Or, I think I heard this on the Tom Woods show. I might try to find this down and get the actual link to it and include it. But they were talking about how this has definitely been done with waterways. People own waterways. If you can prove that somebody has put in some fluid into a river and it goes down river and affects somebody else, you can prove that, yes, these people are the ones who inserted that in the river and it moved on. And I think when you have a situation where you understand your parcel of that thing exists in part because it's come from somewhere else and will go somewhere else. I think once you have that kind of situation, there's an understanding in that ownership of that thing that you're also responsible for what goes after it. Just a similar way that, yes, I'm responsible for the ideas that come into me, into my mind. They're not all mine. The language that I'm using, the ideas that I'm using, I'm getting from somewhere else. But then what I do with those ideas, if I get the idea to push something off a tall building, that it's still the result of that action is still owned by me. So even if you own the air only in that given area, I think whatever comes into it, once it's in that area, you own it. Once it goes out, whatever you've added to it is also your ownership. So that's kind of how I'm imagining this.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so, yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. My only issue with that is, let's say how do I put this? Like, would you consider something that is, let's say, out of your control? Like, let's say there's some physical aspect of nature on your property, and through, maybe like a tree.
Yes.
Right. You have a big tree right on the edge of your property, and you go into your house, you go to sleep, and a thunderstorm knocks that tree down from your property onto your neighbors, and destroys their car or something. Are you responsible for that tree falling and hitting their car?
That depends on a whole lot of things. And, okay, this is something we discussed before we actually got to this conversation, was the law aspect of it. How in some definitions, it was very hard for us to find a definition of private property that did not include some mention of law, which is, again, with the NAP, I think, non-aggression principle, from coming towards, we wanted to avoid this just devolving into a conversation about anarcho-capitalism. But I think, but with laws still exist. So this is the kind of situation where I think it currently happens right now already when you have people living together in areas. I was just at a friend's place in Connecticut this weekend, and they just got a new place, and they already have to, I think 4 times a year, they have to have people come to the grounds and check, because the compound has a slope, and they have to check and see which trees are rotting or which trees might fall, because there's actually an agreement where it's like, look, we understand it could fall on somebody else's land, but it could fall on somebody else's car, but it could also fall on your kid running around the yard. So it's also in your interest to just be safe about that. Now, I think it depends on where the responsibility ends in this situation. Is it a really old tree that's really leaning over and you've been told and somebody has pointed out, and your neighbor decided, I have these 5 acres to park on, but I'm going to decide to park right under this tree. So there's a lot that goes into this. And I think it comes to that point where you just have to set where does the personal responsibility end and start. So in that situation, I can't give a direct yes or no question, but yes, if it's on your property, you are responsible to an extent for whatever occurs on your property. Now, I think in a sensible world, everyone has certain limitations to that responsibility. I mean, to holding somebody else accountable for that situation. We do know there's still, for a lack of a better term, acts of God where we can't just, there's really nothing you can do about it. It's like, okay, it's happened. But yeah. Because even if somebody was going to hold you accountable, they would have to be able to prove your accountability and then set up some kind of...
But that's my question. Like, if... Like, prove that, what, you caused it, or...
Exactly. I think the only time you're responsible... And that comes back to the thing. What is your definite personal responsibility? So how accountable are you? How much ownership do you have over something? I think the higher level of ownership you have over something, the higher responsibility you have over that thing. So your physical body, 100% your responsibility. If you're just standing here, like right now I'm standing here, everything I do is pretty much my responsibility. Now, if somebody comes in here and pushes me and then I hit something else, I am still responsible because I could have stopped myself. But then at the same point, the person would understand, did you push that person? If you're driving a car, now you're taking your physical body, driving that car. You rear end somebody, you're responsible for that action. Your car hit somebody else. Now, if somebody rear ends you and then you hit the car in front of you, your car still hit that person, but can that person hold you as accountable for that behavior as if it was just you? Clearly not. I mean, some people would say yes, but they are not sensible people. We don't have to deal with those people right now. So yeah.
Well, yeah. So I think we've established, like, if you cause it to happen, right? Like if you burn, some coal or whatever, and it affects someone's plans, I think we've established, like, yes, you are of course responsible for that. But I'm talking you own the property, but something outside of your control, not caused by another person, but by nature happens, like a tree falling in a thunderstorm, does you owning that property then make you responsible for that tree falling and damaging someone else's property? I think that's more of the question. Like, it's not, are you responsible even if you didn't have control over it because you own the property? I guess is my question.
Well, no, I think I answered partially before. Let me see if I can come back around to it. I would have to say, to an extent, yes, but very limited responsibility. It gets to the point where it's almost no responsibility whatsoever. Now, okay, let's say somebody had pointed out that tree was an issue, and then you had planned on, let's say it's a Monday, somebody pointed out on Sunday that, look, this is the only place I can park my car. Can you please cut down that tree? And then you say no, and this is all recorded, and then the lightning storm hits on Tuesday, the tree falls and hits that person's car. Would that person let's say just talk about not even the current system of law that we have now, but just in one where people just have an arbitration system where just people have a general understanding in this community, they come, would a judge be able to say, yes, you're responsible because you said no? Now, in that situation, I think they would hold you at a level of responsibility. But at the same point, does that person on their own property have the right to say what you do on your property? I don't know. Because now I'm thinking of another situation where, let's say you said, okay, yes, I'll cut down the tree, but you called somebody to come cut it down on Wednesday, and then on Tuesday, the day before, the tree falls. Would that person still be able to hold you as accountable for that tree falling? So that's why I'm kind of stuck here, because if I say that, yes, you're accountable for saying I'm not going to cut down the tree and then the tree falls, and you are held responsible for that tree falling, then technically, even if you said you're going to cut down the tree and the tree falls before you've cut it down, before the day you plan to cut it down, why would the responsibility really change? I don't think it would.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think regardless you would have responsibility, because if you consider private property an extension of yourself, right, like we defined before, kind of, then, you're responsible for what you do. So if your private property is an extension of yourself, then if a tree falls, I would say you're responsible for that. Even with our own bodies, like there's involuntary things that happen that we don't have control over, but we're still responsible for them, right?
Because you own it.
Right.
Because you own whatever affected something else.
Yeah. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, because you own whatever affected something else. But then now that goes, now we wonder, going back to the intellectual property thing. If somebody takes an idea that you had without your express knowledge or permission, let's say, but now if we say permission, that's kind of assuming that you do own it. Okay, let's say they take an idea of yours without your express knowledge, and they act on it, and it ends up hurting somebody. Can they say it's not my responsibility but somebody else? Which is a very pertinent thing in the current political climate that we live in. People saying, oh, it's not my responsibility, somebody else egged this person on, or they're a victim of institutionalized XYZ. It's not their responsibility. So I think that's a very pertinent question. And I think if we establish what IP is, intellectual property of ideas, ownership of things that other people could take without your direct giving it to them or your direct action of it, then you can also start discussing, how much is it my responsibility by acting on something I heard from somewhere else?
Well, the thing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we're considering intellectual property private property.
But I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to acquiesce on that yet.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I just for me personally, I would consider it something different. But
what would you consider?
Like I said, there's the physical aspect, but how do you? My issue with it is how do you even define an idea? You know, what is it, an idea? Because to me, an idea is in your head, it's in your brain, and you can convey that, but it's never going to be exactly what's in your head. So, like writing something on a piece of paper, it's not really the exact idea. It's an interpretation of it. Then someone else interprets what they see on the paper, and they come up with another idea in their head. To me, that's something different. It's not like if I come up with something, right?
Yeah.
And I come across you in the street, and I say that idea to you. You know, I say it out loud. You're going to think of that in your head. It's not going to be exactly what I think, but I'm, in a sense, implanting an idea in your head by saying it.
Yes.
So if the idea is ultimately what's in your head, you're not really stealing the idea, because first of all, I kind of forced you to think of it. Excuse me. But second of all, it's like, it's not the same thing. You can't really steal someone's thoughts. Do you know what I'm saying? At least not yet. Thank God.
in an extent, but I mean, that comes to the thing where I think which is another reason we're having this conversation. We're trying to establish a definition of private property, or just at least discuss it to a point where both, when we're talking about the actual thing, we're both thinking about the same thing. So that's a good point on the language aspect. So do you own, when you put something out, like this is an example I like saying, if you talk to somebody from the North Pole, let's talk to an Eskimo, and then you talk to some Maasai or something from the Sahara, from the savannah in Kenya, and you talk to both of them about a hot day. You're talking about hot day, but both of them, that term hot is a whole different temperature and experience for each person. Mm-hmm. So is there an actual ownership of that term hot? The idea hot, can you own it? But, I mean, that's a tough situation. Okay, I don't know if you heard of that current, there was like a very recent case about, there was a younger lady, I think, well, I'm saying younger, probably around your age. But it was someone egged her boyfriend on until he committed suicide. Like the guy was, they'd been talking about it over a series of months or weeks or something, and then it got to the point where he was actually in the car doing the whole methane thing. I think it's methane. Where you sit in the garage and you get the car running. And then he freaked out and he was like, I'm not going to do this. And then he came out and he texted his girlfriend, like, I don't want to do this. And then she either called him or texted him, like, get back in the car. You got to do this. And then they got her for, I think, second-degree manslaughter, where they're saying, since she was implanting these ideas into his mind, and when he was about to bail, she kind of said, do this. Now that gets to the point where it's like, okay, so that situation, who was responsible? So second-degree manslaughter, they're holding her somehow responsible for implanting ideas or for encouraging his behavior to kill himself. Now you go further when you have political situations, when you have that recent shooter in Virginia who ostensibly has been listening to a lot of anti-Republican, anti-Trump material saying, yes, we should, these people are evil, these people are bad, they're hurting Americans, so we should go out and fight them. And there was somebody who came out and said, look, this is what it looks like when somebody gets the Second Amendment and fights a despotic government. But yes, I get that, but what makes a person think it's despotic? Now, who is responsible for that situation? Do you just say it's a crazy person, or is it the people who told him that the Republicans are actually evil? then now you go further with the whole like religious thinking of it. If somebody says, a God told me that this person is evil and should fight evil, then who is responsible for the actions when it comes there, the ideas of what evil is? And then I'm going to tie that back into the actual sense of you in the non-aggression principle, you owning the responsibility to decide, is somebody actually a threat to you, where you have to take, when it comes down to it, it's your decision to go out and act on the information that you've taken in. So that was a long non-answer, pretty much. But
no, but I think you got to a key point there. It's because I would say no. I mean, it's a terrible thing to do. Don't get me wrong. But I would say no. She doesn't have responsibility for him doing that because he owns himself. And I think that answers our intellectual property thing. You can't. So I got to backtrack a bit. If I do something on my property, right, my physical land property, that affects yours, right? We agree that that is more or less a violation of the NAP, right?
Yes.
But I would say the equivalent for that with intellectual property would be me saying something that changes the way you think, right? And pretty much anything I say will do that. So, in a sense, if intellectual property was private property, I would constantly be violating the NAP by simply speaking.
But then don't I have... Okay, first of all, there's an option of listening. If I choose to put myself in a public sphere, in a public area, then technically I don't have to be affected by what you said. Now it goes to another point. Let's say you're saying something, but somebody else is saying something in Chinese or some other language I don't understand. They just saying sounds that don't affect me. So they're doing the same. So if it's just the literal sounds being conveyed, then it's like, okay, it doesn't matter because the idea itself hasn't been brought in. Now, if you're talking about something that I consider to be completely nonsensical, if somebody comes and says something about some God has told them to do this, I don't believe in that God. So whatever that person says, establishing it, actually it's almost an opposite situation. How in some situations somebody can say something sensible and then they mention it came from a God, then I'm like, okay, like I'm taking the sense away from that thing. So, so there's a lot of situations in there where I think it's not necessarily how would it be aggression? How would it be initiating force? Because that's the non-aggression principle is mostly initiation of force against somebody else. So if you're just speaking ideas, like what if I had taught you, I'd for some reason convinced you that love means evil or love means hate. And then people are walking around saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. And you're walking around thinking, wow, everybody hates me and it's making you more depressed. Then are they responsible for your depression or are you responsible for not understanding what love is? Or is the person who convinced you that love is hate the one responsible? So I think in that situation, I don't think you can be held responsible for just speaking words in a public sphere that are not necessarily targeted towards somebody. I don't know, that might be making too specific of a situation for it, but...
No, I don't think you really... See, but that's the thing, like, what do you mean by responsibility? You know,
I think responsibility...
It depends... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Actually, I'm going to turn on some lights. But just keep talking. I'm going like incognito over here. So I'll be back. Oh, this is going to help. Yeah. Let's see if this works. No, that's actually worse than it was before. Yeah, so I should have been better prepared for the changing of the night thing. But yeah.
Just an unlocked character.
Yeah, like right there. Was I responsible for the sun going down? No. That was just like a natural thing that happened. But yeah. We partially responsible because we talked about this before and I should have tested this earlier.
Well, yeah, but that goes into, I guess, what is responsibility? Because, so, you could just say someone has responsibility. Like, something happened to say, oh, you're responsible for that, but it doesn't really change anything. So, like, with the instance with the tree falling on, the tree falling, that responsibility is not just having ownership of what happened, assuming that you are responsible, right? So let's assume for a second you are responsible. It's not just having ownership of that. You have to, in some sort of way, either pay back the person or fix any damage you caused. So to me, responsibility, it's not just owning, I'm sorry, I'm responsible for doing that. It's actually physically doing something to make up for the damage you caused in whatever way is possible. Because you can't undo the past, but there are things you can do to kind of make up for it.
So you say that would be for responsibility, but ownership itself does not necessarily include that, right? It's just that the only responsibility is something that can be acted on, or something that can exist after ownership has been effected. So let's say something different happened. Let's say your tree fell on somebody's property and for some reason happened to crack the ground open and find a gold deposit. Would they be willing to share that gold with you? Because I wouldn't have found this gold if your tree hadn't fallen.
Right.
In most cases, I think most people would say no, that person would not want to share that gold with you. But if that tree fell and then cracked something open and that thing caused maybe their house to fall into that hole, they would all of a sudden hold you responsible. They would want to hold you responsible for that negative action.
Well, yeah, that is a good point. And what if violating the NAP actually, again, assuming that you would consider this violating the NAP, what if it actually benefits a person? Do you know what I mean?
Then it's not aggression.
Right.
Because, for example, this upcoming fight, McGregor and what's it called, Mayweather, they're both going to be punching each other in the head. It's not a positive thing to get punched multiple times, but one of them is getting 100 mil, just guaranteed, the other one's getting 20 mil. So it's the same action, but it's not considered a violation of the NAP because it's benefiting both of them greatly. So I think with the NAP, that's the thing. It's responsible for the...
they're agreeing to it, so...
And in an extent, that person agreed to purchase that property next to yours, or once they came near, there's some kind of agreement, we both decide to live here. If it goes back to the car thing, that's another thing I was mentioning before. If the person has perfectly good 5 acres to park their car, but they decide to park it right under this tree that looks like it's going to fall down, then you can also argue, look, come on, man. You can't really hold me responsible for a thunderstorm when this guy could have parked, anywhere else. So it gets to that point where there's...
But the thing is, you can.
You can, but I think that's where it comes. You'd have to argue. And then that's the thing. You have to get to the point where you can argue your point both for or against somebody else. So you own... It's almost like you own the the responsibility for setting who is responsible is also something that you privately own, you personally own. And that's why I think it goes back to that whole idea thing that we're talking about, the IP, intellectual property. Like, is an IP essentially just ideas, just talking and convincing somebody else that this is what I think about this thing, and convincing somebody else that it is that thing, and having people act on the agreement of that idea that you've put out? And that's why I was going back to the thing where, is it IP if I have this idea and I don't do anything with it and somebody else does it without ever hearing about my idea? And that's why I'm a little iffy on IP. And I think personally with some of this, I have a friend who's in that, and I'm telling her, like, IP is not a thing, but she's like, no, it actually is a thing. And I may be personally kind of defending what she was saying, but I get limited IP. And I think it's very hard to have infinite IP. Someone's like, yeah, I own this for forever. But the kind of thing of saying, I own this for a limited amount of time, and if I don't do anything with this idea after this point, I kind of relinquish my protection on it or something.
The thing with IP is, and maybe we'll start shifting the conversation. From a pragmatic standpoint, I think we as a society need it to some level, because what's my motivation to come up with an idea, put all this work in, put all this money in, and then have someone who doesn't put the work in, doesn't put the money in, simply be able to take it, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of things would not have been invented, and we'd be very far behind if we didn't have some sort of legal IP.
Yes.
But on the other side, I still can't consider it private property.
What would you consider it then? Isn't that why they call it intellectual property? It's like, that's why they kind of call it a different. They make a different distinction for it.
Yeah, I mean, certain people do consider it private property, a form of private property, and I guess in a legal sense it would be. Legally, it's private property, but I don't know. It's a tough one.
Isn't property always private? Because even if they say general property, this whole idea of communal property in the communist sense of it doesn't make sense, because it's still not a global thing. There has to be somebody excluded from that situation. Even if you get the situation where 7 billion people own something, the only way for you to say 7 billion people own something is by having one person not have ownership on that thing. Right. Somebody has to be excluded. So I think it's just how you define private. Private does not necessarily have to mean one person. I know in general, we can break it down. It can be 1 to everyone -1. I think that's the kind of thing. I think that's kind of how I think you can define something being privately owned. It can be owned by one person to everyone -1. That's how I'm going to start with. I think that's one of the blocks I'm putting in the whole definition of private property. Who can own private property? How many things can something be owned?
Yeah, so I would group what Congress would call collective property in it, and I think one thing very left-leaning, socialist, communist-minded people fail to recognize is you can have a commune in this society or in any capitalist society.
Yes.
Just get some private property and share it with a bunch of people. So it's not within reach, and I would consider that private property. The thing is, I would not consider government property to be private property. It often is. I mean, I was hiking the other day, and there was this no trespassing private property sign, but it was land owned by the city of Newark.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if I would consider government-owned land private property. I think, and in most of the definitions I saw online, that was a very clear distinction: is government, state property versus private property. Private private citizens.
I think that's another. We've also discussed this now, the difference between government and state, because, as you said, even in ANCAP, non-aggression principle compliant environment, you can still have ostensibly communist enclaves within that community. But what's the difference? Why do you not consider in the current state-owned property? Because I would say it's different between state and government, because I think even in an ANCAP environment, you would have governments, which is just a governing body, which again is just a bunch of people owning things. And I think that's why the state itself gets this weird godlike supernatural effect to it. I think it's like Lewis Black stand-up thing he was talking about, where he was like, yeah, people talk about government like it's some building like striding around, like knocking things over, when it's actually just like a collection of people doing things. So that's what I argue. I think, for me, why I don't really agree with the current state ownership things is because the state does not necessarily represent, in its structure, it doesn't represent what it says it's representing. Like, the people who ostensibly own this land collectively through the state, who are saying, like, it's all of us, who is all of us in that situation? That's not defined, who falls in or falls out of it. You live in Jersey. Since it's state-owned, it's ostensibly your property too, but you can't just go there and build something if you wanted to. You still have to go and ask.
I did it anyway.
Well, anything you say in this podcast can and will be used against you in the state, in the law courts of New Jersey. But yeah, so that's a kind of situation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, that is a good point. I was at a cross-country meet a couple years ago, and it's in this area called Greystone, which is an abandoned mental asylum, but they have like a cross-country course nearby. So it's a weird combination of things. But we were waiting for our race to start, a couple friends and I, and we wanted to check it out because it's a kind of a cool building. And we were just walking around, and this cop shows up, and he's like, "You guys can't be here. It's state property." And my friend goes, "Well, I own this property. I'm a resident of New Jersey." But that's a good point. I think that's going back. Can you really have collective ownership? Because, so in the flaw with like our, I guess, governmental system and the idea that the people own state property is it's a representative democracy, right? It's a republic. So we elect officials who then make decisions for us. But even if it were direct democracy, if a decision was going to be made on, let's say, collective and state property, right? It's a direct democracy, everyone owns it. We're going to make a decision on what to do with it, and we're going to vote on that decision. So everyone votes, and the majority of people want X to happen. Everyone who's not in that majority didn't have a say in what happens with it. So in a sense, they don't own it, right? Yeah. If you own the property and you can't decide what's going to happen with it, I would argue that you don't actually own it. So the only way to really have collective property is to have a consistent consensus on, what are we going to do with this property, right?
Yeah, and I think that would exist it's hard to speak of that in the sense of the world that we live in today, because being part of a state isn't really optional in this situation. Like, where are you going to go where there's no state? And I'm not going to bring up Somalia because, come on. Not children here. But
that's the only thing that will happen in anarchy. Immediately, it's some.
Yeah. But so in that situation, if you're in, like, okay, if you've agreed and you said, let's say you get the situation, 10 friends go out and you're like, okay, we're going to pick somewhere to eat, and you're like, okay, let's vote, and you're like, I don't really care where I'm going to eat, or you decide not to vote. 2 other people vote for Mexican, and then 7 people vote for Chinese. Now, those 2 people who voted can be like, these are not my president people, and be like, oh, that's not my restaurant. But then, because they say, I didn't vote for this restaurant. But then me, who decided not to vote for anything because I just didn't really care, it's still technically not my restaurant because I didn't choose one or the other. But if we all agreed that however many people vote the most, whichever gets the most votes, will all go to that place, then at that point you can say, okay, yes, that's the restaurant we go to. Now, when you apply that to the state, that's the situation. As a republic, it's supposedly you're getting people who are going to represent you and your needs in a grander scale of things. And now that comes to the point, if it's your ideas they're trying to represent, when they go out and put out their own, I don't want to call it ideas, because some of these people don't really have ideas, ideologies, and and the shenanigans that they do. Now, those actions those people do, like now somebody says, look, you guys voted in this politician enacted this. Since I didn't vote for this person, they will say that the regular people who vote for this person are responsible for what that person did, yet they're not responsible. So there's a weird thing. Now that's going back to the whole, I think, the IP thing, the responsibility thing, the private ownership versus personal ownership. Where does the ownership end and begin in that whole situation? Can you hold a country's people, citizens, responsible for a declaration of war that their leaders make, for example? Now, if their leaders violate non-aggression principle by attacking another country, can you hold the people who voted those people in responsible?
I mean, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, going back a little, I do think, like with the restaurant situation, I think that's a little different because there is, I guess, like a level of consenting to democracy. Like if you agree, like we're all going to vote on this, everyone agrees that they will respect the result of the vote. In a sense, you are consenting even if you don't get what you wanted.
Yeah.
But, in our society, there really is no actual consent. There's this supposed social contract that people talk about, but, you never really signed a piece of paper that says, I agree to this system. So I don't know if you could really be held responsible because you're not really consenting to this whole thing. It's just set in place. So you don't really have much of another choice. And you can still vote. I mean, vote for the lesser of two evils, vote for the person you think would be the best. But unless, you have an explicit consent to this system, I would argue, no, you don't have responsibility for that because the whole thing is founded on violating the NAP, on initiation of force. So you in a sense, don't have a choice. If you don't exist within the system, you're going to wind up in jail. If you don't pay your taxes or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Okay, so it goes back to the choice thing. And that's one thing earlier I discussed the whole can you sell yourself into slavery thing. And that's part of the reason why I was thinking no, because I was thinking the only aspect that makes something slavery is the lack of choice in that situation. Because if you choose to be there, you're not a slave. I don't know if it's necessarily the choosing to be there or the choosing or the ability to choose to leave once you're there does that have to continue? Like, once you sold, like, okay, let's say you sell yourself into slavery, or if somebody captures you and then you're technically a slave, they take you somewhere, but once you arrive at that location where you're enslaved, if the person tells you, yeah, you have to do this work, and then at X day, all of a sudden you can leave if you want to. If everything is exactly the same, you're still beaten as much, or you're still fed as much, or you're still treated exactly the same, but on the one day when the person has said that if you leave, I'm not going to get you back, I'm not going to like force you to stay, I'm not going to capture you, you're automatically not a slave at that point, right? Because from that point, you own your being in that location, right?
Yes, but also no, because like becoming a slave has, I guess, put you in a different position that you have not chosen, right? That's a good example because after the Civil War, like a lot of slaves stayed on the actual plantations even though they were free, but because it was the best option for them. If they didn't, they would have been worse off. But I would also argue you're still, in a sense, a slave because being a slave previously has created a different situation for you where you're going to be, I guess, forced to make different decisions, right? Like if you were once a slave and then you're freed, you're in a different position than if you had never been a slave. And it's the same like people who get falsely accused of a crime, and then later on, the court's like, oh, actually, you're not guilty, you're free to go. To me, it's not just an act of letting them go. You also have to the best of your ability. I mean, you can't, like I said, you can't undo the past, but to the best of your ability, make up for all that time that was lost with you being jailed that they took away from you.
Yeah, there is a situation where the effect, you don't own the past effect of, let's say, being crippled by somebody. Like, you see, and it's a tough thing. Now, this is why it also goes through the ideas, because if somebody just thinks they're enslaved, but they're not, like, let's say you put in that room, as I was saying before, if somebody tells you love is hate and hate is love, even though it doesn't change what those things actually are, but your perception of it changes. So let's say you were treated well as well as you can as a slave, which goes into the whole current state system that we exist in. And I was having this conversation with somebody asking, are we technically more enslaved now because some populations that may be more comfortable than in the past have more reliance on somebody else to provide them just basic needs, food, shelter, the daily bread, quote unquote, than you did in the past. Somebody in the past may have needed to be working in the farm. Like I just saw this thing saying kitchen prep used to be like 40 hours a week. It's like a full-time job, just food prep, just cooking food. Now people just go and buy something from the store and it's like 1 hour, 10 minutes in the microwave. But at the same point, you have major cities that only have food stocked for a day. That if you shut off all the transportation coming into that city, they'd only have food for a day. So now you talk about a slave in the past. They were working the farms. If the master died, they'd probably be able to feed themselves from a year without leaving that one area. Right. But now you have situations where we're ostensibly super free in New York City, but if you just shut down New York City for a day, people would be starving immediately. Yeah. So it gets to the point. So what is the slavery in that situation? Well, the point I was trying to make was with the ownership of the ideas, can you be enslaved without knowing that you're enslaved? Is it your responsibility? See, we're talking about the responsibility where you're saying in the past, the person crippled you by being a slave. You were crippled by what happened in the past. So you can't really be held responsible for not getting up and leaving when you can. So you can say, okay, no, this person is still staying there because they have nothing more better to do in their life, or they have no other opportunities. But I think once you choose to be there, even if you make the decision that you think there's nothing worse to do this, because now you can ask, if you're a slave, technically you could kill yourself. You know, and technically you could say, if you're saying like slavery is 100% due to the person not having any other options, there is almost always the option of suicide. Which, is that even an option or is it not? You know, have I decided personally is it my personal responsibility because I've decided to not kill myself and physically stay here? So can I say that it's slavery? And I think now with that sense, you can go with a non-aggression principle and kind of apply that to the ultimate source of private property, which is yourself. And I think you also owe it on yourself to not end yourself. So kind of suicide, I think this might be a whole other conversation. Is suicide a violation of the non-aggression principle to yourself? Like, I would argue it kind of is. With somebody else enslaving you would be more, letting somebody else enslave you and not killing yourself would be more NAP compliant than killing yourself in a way. That should be a whole other conversation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to go there. But yeah, where are we right now?
We're in the weeds. we're in there. We're in the thickets. We're all over the place. I think we're still in the forest of private property. But I think that for me, I think one solid thing I have gotten so far was the whole aspect that who can own private property, and the whole thing, like, it could be one person to everybody -1. I think that's one solid thing I've gotten so far. That I don't know if you have an objection to that.
Yeah, well, we were talking about right. If you want to, you can collectively own something because you're consenting to democratic rule. Right? Would you agree with that? Like that's how corporations work too. It's democratically, decisions are made democratically. So would you say, like, if you consent to democracy, because in a sense, democracy is a form of slavery if you don't consent to it. You're a slave to the majority, So if you're not in that majority, you're forced to do whatever they decide. So
one of my favorite quotes.
Then we have the issue of, can you sell yourself into slavery? So if you're consenting to a democracy, are you, in a sense, selling yourself into slavery? I mean,
see, that's why the slavery thing. I think it's how much ownership do you have? That's the thing. It goes off, I think, of the personal ownership, the personal property, the private property thing does define what slavery is, I think. Now, if you own yourself, do you constantly have ownership over yourself, at least within a certain agreement? So once you agree that I am going to be in X place and do X thing until X thing is achieved, and then you have responsibility to hold me accountable to this point, then that's not slavery. Even if it's like the boxing match, even if it's this punching, even if I say, I'm going to be a slave role play, and I'm going to decide to role play as a slave for X amount of time and be treated as worse as any slave has been treated, because you've chosen to be there, you own the beatings and the behavior that's happened to you. So it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, because you've chosen to be subjected to all that happens in that situation.
Right.
So once that allotted time or whatever has been achieved, you take the ownership back to yourself. And now if somebody imposes that same behavior on you against your wishes, then it's slavery. Then that's when it's a violation of the NAP. And that's when just your thoughts, your ideas, things that you have in your mind not wanting to be done to you, now I think it gets to that point where
See, but yeah, I think there are instances where you kind of can sell yourself into slavery. I guess another example would be like with credit cards. You know, by agreeing to that, you agree if you go into debt, you're in a sense a slave to the credit card company, right? Because you owe them. So,
but you're not a slave per se, because you told them, "I will. If you lend me this money now, I will pay you back at a certain time." And that's another point. It's they say, okay. I did a video on this about the student. Okay,
yeah,
the student loan epidemic.
Slavery.
Yeah.
You know?
So, what is in that situation? Is the person capable? Now, it goes back to the whole like IP thing. It goes back to the private property, personal ownership. If somebody is a 15-year-old, are they capable of owning their actions? Now, if you say yes, this 15-year-old is capable of owning their actions, then they are technically responsible for taking that loan out. Or if you say their guardians are responsible, then their guardians are responsible for letting them take that loan out. So they shouldn't be able to say, okay, forgive this debt, because they should be responsible for that action. So,
So I guess it's just not slavery then. Slavery would be... I guess we have to define slavery then. I mean, what would...
Can we define slavery before we get more of an idea of what private property is?
Well, I think it ties into the NAP, so I think it's important. Because, I mean, we've already established without a doubt you own yourself.
Yes.
So... I mean,
Okay.
Because
No, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No. You know, because another thing is, like, if you look at the United States or any nation as, I guess, just private property. Like, the United States is one block of private property, right? If you view it as that, then are you really enslaved by being here? Because you're free to leave, you know? Just like if I own land and you're on that land and I have a set of rules that I require you to follow, or you must leave, don't you think it could be the same thing?
In a sense.
What is fundamentally different about a nation or a state or a town versus private property?
Well, I think with the state thing, of course, one of the things with the state is you kind of don't get to choose what state you're a part of. There are arbitrary rules. You can be part of a state without your express permission. You can be considered part of a state. At least the state itself will treat you exactly the same as it would treat somebody else who's gung-ho and super happy about being part of the state. So, like right now, whether you're a not my president pussy hat wearing pink hat or whatever, or like a Trump red hat, like MAGA loving deplorable, the state treats you as a ward of the state, regardless. Now, with the house thing, if I'm like, this is my party, I'm having a house, like right now, this conversation, it's like you can leave whenever you want. It's not like I'm going to be like force you to stay there. I'm not even going to charge you to leave. But then technically with the state, it does charge you. Like I think if you rescind your citizenship, there's ways to do it where you get charged. Now, if you don't do that, if you, let's say, just left America and you went somewhere else and were living there and had nothing to do with the country, you would still be subject to taxes and even the laws. I'm pretty sure even the laws of the country. I know when you're like a diplomat, even if you're living in some other country, some other state, you can have the diplomatic immunity. Okay, diplomatic immunity, if you're a diplomat, that's guaranteed. But let's say an American citizen commits a crime, just a regular American citizen commits a crime in some other country, they can ostensibly say that they should be held accountable to the laws of that country. I think that goes more to the power of the country, whether the country wants to risk it. Like, for instance, if somebody from Uganda comes to America and commits a crime, Uganda's not going to be like, yeah, let's bring the guy back. But if America is like, okay, Uganda, bring that guy back, Ugandan government might be like, okay, maybe we will. But so there's some intricacies of statecraft there that makes the state, I think, an entirely different beast, which I think comes to that whole.
But don't you think, like, if you view every country as a piece of private property, you know, if you invite me into your house, or I'm somehow in your house for whatever reason, and then I smash a window and leave, and I go to your neighbor's property, and then you call them up and say, you know, I want this guy back. He's a criminal. I'm on their property, so I'm still on someone else's property. Like I'm talking about a situation where, you know, because I think private property works very well in like a colonization stage. Like the United States is a good example. You know, people would simply go out into the woods and claim land and say, this is my land. But once we get to a point where no matter where you go, you're on someone else's property, are you then in a sense a slave? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, does not owning property make you a slave because you're constantly under the rule of someone else's property? And the same could be said for different states or different nations.
I think a kind of situation we could go back to children. If you have a child, are they your slave? Because technically they don't really own anything as a child besides their physical body. Now, I think...
Yeah, Murray Rothbard had brought up that issue. And I think that's one of the biggest, I guess, issues people have with like pure non-aggression principle is if you were to like have pure NAP, like no exceptions, once you, like if you're a mother and you give birth to a child, is simply moving that child from where it's born violating the NAP because the child's not consenting to you pick it up.
Oh, did you see that?
You know
did you see
and
that
obviously
story?
It's a ridiculous situation, but I think it brings up a good point. Like, are you violating the NAP by raising a child?
No, I think clearly not. I mean, that situation, there was a story like that, actually. There was somebody who was completely on the whole unparenting thing. I don't know if you saw that story. I'll try to... somebody was literally doing that. She said she was at the point where she asks her child if he can carry the child. So it's just completely ridiculous. No, and that's a beautiful world we live in. Like, you just think of something completely absurd, and you're like, yeah, that happened, actually. Like, holy...
Someone probably in Florida, actually.
So, okay, in that situation, no, because the child will... You're not harming the child, first of all. You're not intentionally harming the child, and it's a kind of situation where would somebody consider it harm? I'm going to borrow this, I think, from Stefan Molyneux. He uses this example a few times, where it's like, if you're hanging from a building, let's say for some reason you fell out of your window, and you're hanging by the window, and you decide to kick your way into somebody else's apartment to save yourself from dying, would that person come in and charge you for the window? I mean, they might, but technically, like, yeah, of course. Like, if they were there, they would have probably opened the window and let you in. Now, if you're just sitting across the street and you just throw something and blow the window, the same exact action, because the action itself isn't aggression. I don't think you can, that's the thing, I don't think you can aggress against something that doesn't own itself. I think private property and the non-aggression principle kind of go together. You can't have the non-aggression principle if people don't own themselves and their actions. Because what would you be aggressing against? Like, you can't can't aggress against a rock technically because the rock doesn't really own itself. It's an inanimate. It's an inanimate creature or thing. So,
but what if I own that rock? Like, what if that's on my property? And
then I am aggressing against you, not the rock.
Right.
So when it comes to
aggressing against my property, which is an extension of myself.
Yeah.
So
now when it comes to the child, it's similar to how you mentioned with the slavery situation, how you can say, like, at that point, the slave might be understood to stay on the farm because they've been enslaved and they've been crippled to a situation, or mentally crippled, where they don't really understand what the world is. So you get to the point where you're like, okay, you can't hold them to the same level of responsibility as you would a relatively free person. So now with the child, you have to, can the child feed themselves? Can the child clothe themselves? Did the child choose to be there? There's so many things I think you can consider that put children in an entirely different sphere.
This goes back to, I think, our original text conversation that this whole thing stems from is we left off at this point where we need to figure out what is harm, right? How do you define harm?
Yeah.
Because, and, you know, to me, like, have you ever seen the movie Elf?
With Will Ferrell?
With Will Ferrell?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know that when he goes into the Christmas store and he, you know, redoes everything and makes it look a lot nicer?
Yeah.
You know that scene? It's something like that. It's like he's not harming them because he's made it better. He's improved the store and more people would want to go there. They'll make more money.
Yeah.
But in a sense, I still would say he's still violating the NAP. He's still trespassing. You know, he's not. I don't think it's an issue of harm or not harm. I think it's an issue of consent.
So, yeah, I mean, that is true because the non-aggression principle, as we said with the boxing match, the same action to itself, without the consent to, I consent to you punching me in the face, you know, without you consenting to someone punching you in your face, that punch becomes a violation of the non-aggression principle. So once you've consented to that action, then yes, then... And now, okay, this goes back to IP, that it's the thought that counts thing. If somebody says something, does an action with intention to help you, and you personally find it not helpful, have you violated the non-aggression principle, or is there an objective way to figure that out, which I think is what we're trying to do with this, trying to figure out, is there an objective sense of, okay, something has been violated here? And I think it's very key because you have these people who are saying, I'm offended because you said this. And someone's like, I had no intention to mean that. I wasn't even talking to you. Yet somebody can say they own the offense. And as we said before, if you're just walking out saying words, it's not a violation of the NAP because even somebody just hears them and changes what they're thinking. I don't think you can necessarily be held that responsible for their reaction to it. So,
well, yeah, I think we've established that intellectual property is a separate thing, and I mean, freedom of speech, you can say whatever you want. You know, I don't. But yeah, so
with the harm thing,
I think the issue with harm is it's subjective. You know, I could consider one thing improving. You know, if I go over to your house and in the middle of the night and paint your siding a different color.
Yeah.
And your house was like old or whatever. I could consider that an improvement, but you may not like that. You know, there might be some like charm that the old siding had or whatever. So to me, I don't think it's an issue of harm or you know, or benefit. I think it's an issue of consent. If you own property, it doesn't matter what someone's doing to it, you know, whether, even if it does wind up benefiting you and you like it, you know, you can make a choice to not, like with the window thing where the person falls into the window. You can make a choice to not make an issue out of it. You don't have to, like I said, you can let people on your property. You can, if it's not an issue to you, then you can let it go. But I don't think we should live in a world where I can go over to your house, mess with your property, and, say, well, that's objectively good. I've objectively improved your property. Therefore, I have not violated the NAP. I don't think that's possible.
The property. So, yeah, because once you put mess, you put a value judgment that I'm considering it negative. So, yeah, so you're saying any alteration without somebody's consent is a violation of the non-aggression principle. But then, yeah, it goes back to the thing, harm. Is that considered aggression? Or is it non-aggression? Or should it be the non-lack of consent principle?
It's voluntarism. It's got to be voluntary, right? If there's no consent, it's not voluntary. So
with the voluntarism, somebody brought up some arguments about people who are absolute voluntarists, and I think that goes to that whole kid situation where it's like, oh, the kid hasn't consented to being picked up, so I have to ask the child. But would the kid consent, or can the kid consent?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a pragmatic, realistic level. Like, obviously you're going to raise a child and it's not going to agree with everything. But I think that brings up issues with, I would not consider myself a pure voluntarist. I wouldn't even consider myself an anarchist. I think pragmatically we need some level of a state. But yeah, I do think it all goes down to like the ideal, which is voluntarism. Like, that's an ideal. I don't know if we'd ever be able to achieve it, but yeah, I guess it's all centered around consent. I think that's the most important thing.
Okay, so the topic we had here was private property. I think you're winding this down. We've been talking for a while, but I think let's put some kind of summary to what we've discussed and kind of set up what we're going to continue in the next conversation, because I think there's still a lot more to go over. So, with the private property and the consent, try to tie those two together. As we'd mentioned with the definitions that we were seeing for private property, a lot of them had to do with law and assignment of rights or that kind of ability. So whether it's assignment from rights, let's say you own yourself, I think part of this self-ownership begins to the point where you're even self-aware of yourself and your actions. This is why I don't think children can own things, because they're essentially just, most of their behavior is completely, for at least for everything that we know, is just reactions. Just like, I don't really hold a tree responsible for growing towards the sun, because it's just growing towards the sun. You know, if something happens, when the rain happens and the roots go, the tree can't get up and move somewhere else. It's just going to slowly lean and fall on the ground and onto that car or whatever as we discussed with that situation. So it's not responsible. It's just reacting. So when it gets to the point, you have to, I think as a person, get to the point where you even have consent of yourself and you understand that you own your actions. You understand that I mood this. When I say when I'm hungry because I haven't eaten. So it's my responsibility to either make food or get somebody's attention. You understand there's a process in there of, I don't want to say, you understand there's a process there of ownership or consent of you doing an action and it resulting in something else, and that whatever has resulted happened due to your action, and you've accepted that to a level. Does that make any sense? Is that something we can agree on?
Yeah. And I think that kind of solves the issue of the children. Is in order to have self-ownership, you need self-awareness.
Yes.
So we could agree on that. A baby is not self-aware. They don't even really know that they exist. So you can't own something if you're not aware that you own it.
Yes. So
right?
That's now with the definitions that you've seen out there with the assignment of something. Do you have to be assigned that ownership? Does somebody else have to be there to recognize your ownership of something? For example, if you just were one person in an area do you technically need to own anything? Is there is there private ownership without somebody else being able to not own it or own it? And I think no, from that thing we said where private property has to be defined by either one person owning something or everybody negative one person. There has to be, once you own something, someone else has to not own it for it to be owned.
It's all relative.
Okay. So, have to be self-aware. Private property is a relative situation, or it's in, once somebody owns something, automatically somebody else can't own that thing.
And then, the responsibility thing, would you conclude that you hold responsibility? If you own something, you then also hold responsibility for it?
To an extent, yes. And that responsibility should grow from how much you own that thing, which I don't think we really discussed. Maybe that should be the...
Yeah, like levels of ownership. Like, can you partially own something?
Yes.
Or yeah. I think we need to go back to the tree scenario because I think that was a little more open-ended and kind of come to a consensus with that. But yeah, like you said, self-awareness is required for ownership or awareness. The second thing. What was the second thing again?
The second one was it's relative. It's somebody, for you to own something, somebody else has to not own it. There has to be some kind of competition or some kind of state of non-ownership of that thing. I think we can think of a more technical way to put it or something.
Yeah, but I think those two things are established. We need to discuss responsibility further, and I guess consent we should discuss further. I'm not really sure where we stand with that.
Well, the consent was... consent in what sense? Was that the whole way I can consent for... I think once you own something, you can consent for somebody else to do something with that thing, to that thing.
No,
right?
I think... So we've kind of changed... Right, your whole... And I don't know if it's in the non-aggression principle, but at least with private property... It's not so much an issue of harming, it's an issue of consenting, right? Because, like I said, I could go over to your house and paint it, redo the siding. To me, I consider that not harming you, it's an improvement. But you didn't, the other person didn't consent to it. So I would still, consider that a violation of the NAP.
I think that comes to defining what aggression is, what harm is. And I think that, that's something we can discuss.
But I wouldn't even define it as harm. Although, I guess it's...
But the NAP specifically uses aggression. So I think harm... Can you be aggressive to something without harming that thing? That's the thing, because now a punch is a punch, regardless of whether the consent is in. So that consent thing is definitely key. That consent, No, that's definitely something we need to discuss.
Maybe we need to discuss the NAP more, but I would consider any form of me doing something to you without your consent, I would consider that a form of aggression, right?
Well, there can be, there's definitely implied consent in certain situations. It's a whole lot different. You just walking down the street into every house and painting it periwinkle blue versus me having told you my favorite color is periwinkle blue, you having the keys to my house and coming in one day and be like, hey, let me surprise him and paint it periwinkle blue. So I think there's a level of implied consent in that situation. Like we said with the...
Yeah. But I think it all stems down to the window situation. If you do want, because why does the NAP exist? Well, obviously it's going to be violated. It's violated all the time. But ideally, if it is violated, because it has to be violated. If my tree falls on your property, I didn't control that, right? So it will happen. The solution, or making up for the NAP being violated would be some form of reparation. Like, I either pay for you to get another car, or I fix your car, or whatever. So, yes, the NAP will be violated. If it's not an issue to you, I guess that's what it is. If it's not an issue to you, right? Like, you pay my house, I'm like, oh, that's great, thanks for doing that. We're fine. But if you do it and I'm like, no, I didn't want you to do that, you would have to make up for it in some sort of way.
Yeah, so non-aggression principle does not necessarily say anything about the results or the things that will occur by not violating or by violating it. It's just, like I said, it's as it says, it's a principle. So it's something to aim for, but it doesn't necessarily have a structure on it, because, as you say, with the subjective aspect of it, it can have one behavior to one person could be a violation of the NAP to somebody else, even if it's the same exact action. Even if you thought, let's say I asked you 100% to go to this house at this address, and you were 100% in your mind thought that was my house, and you went in there and painted it on my express instructions, and then it's somebody else's house, that's a violation of the non-aggression principle on that person. But if you just went to a house to the left, which was my house, or if I gave you the wrong address, then that same exact action wouldn't be, or if I'd purchased that house. So, yeah, that could be an entire subject on its own, because I'm still not quite sure about how consent works in that situation, or
I think aggression needs to be discuss further on that, because that could be a very long conversation too.
Yes. Speaking of long conversations, we have been at this for almost 2 hours now. So definitely lovely conversation. We've been talking about doing this for a while, and I think this will be the first of many. If
I sure hope so.
Yes, if it comes down to enslaving you to your Skype and making this a thing, I think we'll get this going. But thanks a lot to Nick, and thanks to you guys for listening. Anything else you want to say? Any closing words?
No, I think it was a good discussion. I was honestly surprised at the level of detail we went into. I mean, we really got into it, but that's what I wanted. I think that's important. So in the future, let's do this again. Let's finish our unresolved issues, and great chat.
All right. So, I'll try to leave some links. Yeah, Nick, if you have any links you think might be pertinent to the things we've discussed, I'll probably upload this in a couple of days. But, let me know. And like, share, and subscribe for you guys listening. Thanks for listening for this long thing. May break it up into 2 parts, but I'll probably upload it as one. But,
All right. Take care, Silas.
Bye.